History's most embarrassing rulers didn't lose power because of bad luck or overwhelming enemies. They lost it because they were genuinely, spectacularly, almost unbelievably bad at the one job they had. Romulus Augustulus was 14 years old when he became the last emperor of Rome, and he lasted exactly 10 months before being pensioned off like a minor inconvenience. 7 rulers across 7 civilizations made decisions so catastrophically wrong that historians still argue over whether to laugh or weep. What kind of incompetence does it actually take to destroy an empire you were simply handed? The throne is the most powerful seat a human being can occupy, and history assumed that power would sharpen whoever sat in it. What it actually did was expose them. Every weakness, every delusion, every catastrophic blind spot, magnified to a scale that entire nations had to live with. These weren't tragic heroes brought low by fate. They were disasters wearing crowns, and the evidence is damning. Romulus Augustulus didn't just lose Rome. He barely noticed it was gone. The Western Roman Empire didn't end with a last stand or a burning capital. It ended with a teenager getting a pension. Romulus Augustulus was 14 years old when his father, a military strongman named Orestes, placed him on the throne in 475 AD. Orestes needed a face for the throne, and his own son was conveniently available. The boy had no army, no allies, and no actual authority over anything that mattered. He was a prop, wearing a crown, ruling an empire that had already collapsed in every way except on paper. When the Germanic chieftain Odoacer marched on Ravenna in 476, Romulus didn't fight. He surrendered almost immediately. Odoacer looked at this frightened teenager and decided he wasn't even worth killing. He exiled Romulus to a castle in southern Italy and sent him a yearly stipend to live on comfortably. The man who ended Rome found its last emperor so unthreatening that he essentially gave him a retirement package. Romulus Augustulus lived out his days in quiet obscurity, probably the only Roman emperor to die peacefully of old age. The throne that had once commanded the known world passed away not in fire, but in paperwork. And the next ruler history handed everything to would prove just as helpless, in ways far more spectacular. Romulus Augustulus at least had the excuse of being a child when Rome collapsed around him, but Honorius had no such alibi. He ruled the Western Roman Empire for nearly 30 years, commanded one of the ancient world's most formidable military machines, and watched his capital city burn from a safe distance. When a messenger arrived in 410 CE to report that Rome had fallen to Alaric's Visigoths, Honorius reportedly burst into grief, because he thought the messenger meant his pet chicken, also named Roma. Once he understood it was merely the eternal city, he calmed right down. That story may be embellished, but the behavior it describes is completely consistent with the historical record. Honorius spent his reign hiding behind walls in Ravenna while generals, rivals, and barbarian warlords carved up everything his predecessors had built. A commander capable of defending the empire out of paranoid jealousy. The city he abandoned wasn't just a city. It was the symbolic heart of a civilization that had stood for 8 centuries. Cowardice can be forgiven in a private man, but in an emperor, it becomes policy, and policy becomes catastrophe. The question worth asking is whether Honorius was simply afraid, or whether he genuinely couldn't grasp what he was losing, because one of those flaws can be overcome, and the other cannot. Most rulers on this list lost their empires through neglect or stupidity, but Valerian managed something far more spectacular. In 260 CE, The Roman Emperor Valerian rode out to face the Sasanian king Shapur I at the Battle of Edessa. And he never came back. Shapur didn't just defeat the Roman army, he captured the emperor himself alive on the battlefield. No Roman emperor had ever been taken prisoner before, and none would be again, which tells you something about how singular this disaster was. Valerian spent the rest of his life in Persian captivity, paraded before foreign crowds as a living trophy of Rome's humiliation. Shapur reportedly used Valerian as a human footstool when mounting his horse. Whether that's literally true or Persian propaganda, the image stuck. The Persians carved it into rock reliefs that still exist today. Valerian, frozen in permanent submission for 2,000 years. Can you imagine any modern monument built specifically to celebrate your enemy's emperor kneeling at your feet? The Roman Senate scrambled to pretend it hadn't happened, installing a new emperor and erasing Valerian from official memory as fast as they could. But Shapur made sure the world remembered, and the stone didn't lie. Some failures outlast the empires that caused them. Justin II inherited one of the most powerful thrones on earth and spent the next decade methodically destroying everything handed to him. He provoked wars he couldn't win, surrendered territories Rome had held for centuries, and drained the treasury chasing ambitions he had no strategy to support. By 574 AD, the losses had piled so high that something inside Justin simply broke. He stopped functioning as an emperor and started functioning as a threat to anyone who came near him. Attendants learned to approach with caution because Justin had developed a habit of biting them, not metaphorically, not in a fit of rage, but compulsively, like a man whose mind had slipped entirely free of its moorings. The palace solved this problem the way Byzantine bureaucracy solved most problems, with procedure. They built him a wheeled cart and rolled him through the corridors, while musicians played constantly to drown out his screaming. Think about what that actually means. An empire of millions, governed around the schedule of a shrieking man on a cart. The machinery of Byzantine power didn't collapse, it simply absorbed the madness and kept running, which raises a darker question than the breakdown itself. Nero had Rome burning around him, but at least his delusions came with a certain theatrical flair. Nero didn't want to be emperor. He wanted to be famous. He spent his reign composing poetry, performing on stage and racing chariots, while his advisors quietly ran the empire he'd inherited. When Rome caught fire in 64 AD, a blaze that consumed 10 of the city's 14 districts, Nero was reportedly 30 miles away at his villa in Antium. He returned not to organize relief, but to watch the spectacle from a tower and, according to Tacitus, sing about the fall of Troy. Whether he started the fire is still debated, but what isn't debated is what he did with the ashes. He seized the cleared land to build a palace so vast it had a rotating dining room and a 100-foot golden statue of himself at the entrance. His subjects were homeless, and Nero was redecorating. The empire's finances buckled under the construction costs, and Nero's response was to debase the currency and execute anyone who questioned him. He then left Rome entirely for a 2-year performance tour of Greece, competing in Olympic events the Greeks rescheduled just to accommodate him, winning every contest he entered because no judge dared score him honestly. He came home with 1,800 first-place crowns and a rebellion already burning in the provinces. The question isn't whether Nero was cruel. It's whether he was even paying attention to the empire he was destroying. Some rulers burn their kingdoms down in one spectacular moment, but John of England took the slower, more thorough approach of losing everything piece by piece. He inherited the Angevin Empire, England, Normandy, Anjou, vast stretches of France, and within a decade, he'd surrendered most of it to the French king through a combination of military blunders and catastrophic betrayals of his own allies. His barons, exhausted by his cruelty and his habit of imprisoning nobles on invented charges, finally forced him to sign a document in 1215 that stripped the English crown of powers it had never surrendered before. Magna Carta wasn't a noble experiment in democracy. It was a humiliation extracted from a king his own lords no longer trusted to behave like a human being. John agreed to its terms, then immediately wrote to the Pope begging to have it annulled, which tells you everything about his relationship with promises. The barons responded by inviting the French crown prince to come take his throne, which, to be fair, was a reasonable next step. Then, in October 1216, John made his final contribution to English history using the royal treasure, the crown jewels, gold plate, sacred relics, in the Wash, a tidal estuary on the Norfolk coast. The exact cause is still debated, but the convoy crossed at the wrong time and the tide came in, and centuries of accumulated royal wealth simply vanished into the mud. John died of dysentery 9 days later, which history records without a great deal of sympathy. Whether it was one catastrophic character flaw or simply a lifetime of bad judgment compounding itself, the result was the same: a king who reshaped constitutional history not through vision, but through failure so total it forced everyone around him to build safeguards against the next man like him. The Ottoman Empire in 1640 commanded half the known world, and it handed that power to a man who had spent his entire childhood locked in a cage. Ibrahim I emerged from years of solitary confinement so psychologically fractured that his court struggled to convince him the throne was real. What followed wasn't a reign so much as a slow-motion collapse of a man who had never been taught what sanity looked like. He filled his palace with hundreds of concubines, then had his chambers lined floor to ceiling in sable fur because ordinary silk no longer satisfied him. When a rumor reached him that one of his women had taken a lover, he didn't investigate. He ordered all 280 of them bound and thrown into the Bosphorus. Witnesses on the shore watched sacks surface and sink in the current while Ibrahim returned to his throne. His grand viziers tried to manage him, his mother tried to contain him, and his religious advisors tried to reason with him. Every institution that should have stopped a ruler this dangerous instead found ways to work around him, which only made him worse. Eventually, the court ran out of workarounds, and the men who had enabled him for 8 years had him strangled in his own palace. The question Ibrahim leaves behind isn't really about madness. It's about every official who saw what he was and kept the machinery running anyway. Wenceslas IV of Bohemia didn't just fail at ruling. He made failure look like a deliberate lifestyle choice. He was Holy Roman Emperor-elect and King of Bohemia, which meant he commanded the most powerful throne in medieval Europe, and he spent much of that time either drunk, imprisoned, or both. His own nobles locked him up not once, but twice, deciding that a captive king was more manageable than a free one conducting state business from a bathhouse. When he did surface to govern, the results were rarely encouraging. He allegedly had a cook roasted alive because the man had underprepared a meal, which suggests his standards for cuisine outpaced his standards for statecraft. The Holy Roman Empire, already a fractious tangle of competing princes, simply stopped waiting for him and elected a replacement while he was still technically on the throne. You have to wonder what it says about a political system when deposing the emperor feels like routine maintenance. His nobles didn't hate him out of ambition, they were just exhausted. And exhaustion, it turns out, can topple a crown just as cleanly as a sword. Montezuma II ruled over millions of people, commanded armies that had never lost a war, and sat at the center of the most powerful empire in the Americas. When Hernán Cortés landed on the Mexican coast in 1519 with roughly 500 soldiers, Montezuma didn't mobilize against him. He sent gold. Not as a bribe, but as a theological gesture, because Aztec prophecy described a feathered serpent god named Quetzalcoatl returning from the east in a year that matched Cortés's arrival almost exactly. Montezuma's entire conceptual world told him that destroying this visitor might mean destroying a deity, and that paralysis proved more lethal than any battlefield defeat. He invited Cortés into Tenochtitlan, a city of 200,000 people, and housed the Spanish inside the imperial palace itself. Cortés repaid that hospitality by taking Montezuma hostage in his own throne room, using the emperor's own authority to hollow out the empire from within. Montezuma then addressed his own people on behalf of his captors, and the crowd threw stones at him. Their god king, speaking for strangers with guns. He died shortly after, whether by Spanish hands or his own people's remains disputed. But the outcome was the same either way. His failure wasn't ignorance or cowardice in any ordinary sense. It was a man whose entire framework for understanding the world made the right decision literally unthinkable. The question that haunts the next ruler on this list is darker still. What happens when the throne itself is the catastrophe?
Charles II of Spain didn't fail the throne through laziness or cruelty or even bad judgment. He never had a chance. Centuries of Habsburg inbreeding had folded the same genetic material back on itself so many times that the damage was visible before he could walk. His jaw protruded so far he couldn't close his mouth, and chewing solid food was something he had to learn like a skill. He was 4 years old before he could walk, and he never learned to read with any real fluency. The men who surrounded him, ministers, priests, court physicians, propped him on the throne and governed in his name while his body slowly failed around them. He was married twice, and both queens reported the same thing: a man who was exhausted by the effort of simply being alive. When he died in 1700 at 38, he left no heir, and that absence tore Europe apart. The War of the Spanish Succession killed hundreds of thousands and redrew the continent's borders for a generation. Every other ruler in this story made choices. Charles II was the choice, made for him by a dynasty that valued bloodline over everything else. The institution didn't just fail him, it built him to fail, and then handed him an empire. Every one of these men held absolute power, and every one of them collapsed under its weight. Romulus Augustulus, a boy emperor discarded by the empire he nominally ruled, lasted less than a year before history forgot his name. Honorius watched Rome burn from behind his palace walls and asked if his chicken was safe. Valerian marched an army into a trap and spent his final years as a Persian footstool. Justin II descended into madness so complete that his court wheeled him through the halls screaming, while the empire quietly governed itself. Nero burned the city he claimed to love and blamed the people who had nowhere left to live. King John lost England's crown jewels in a swamp and died eating too many peaches, unmourned by almost everyone. Ibrahim I issued decrees from a throne draped in fur, executed his entire harem on a rumor, and ruled the Ottoman Empire for 8 years before his own mother signed his death warrant. Wenceslas IV spent his reign drunk, hunting, and occasionally ordering the torture of priests who annoyed him. Montezuma II commanded the most powerful empire in the Americas and handed it to a few hundred strangers because the omens felt wrong. Charles II of Spain was so thoroughly destroyed by generations of inbreeding that his own autopsy read like a medical horror story.
Not one of these men faced a system that could stop them before the damage was done. And that is the pattern. Not bad luck, not bad timing, but the total absence of anyone with the power to say no. The throne doesn't reveal character. It removes every obstacle that character was supposed to clear.